Nobody at St. Catherine's General paid much attention to Eleanor Voss, and that suited her fine. She arrived 40 minutes before every shift, hung her coat in the same locker, and moved through the halls with a kind of economy that other people mistook for coldness. She was 31, still inside her probationary year, still being quizzed by senior staff, who liked to remind her in small ways that she hadn't earned her place yet. Her resume didn't have the right pedigree. No teaching hospital back east, no glowing reference from a famous surgeon, just a community college program and a gap in her work history that nobody had bothered to ask about. Because in their minds, a quiet woman with an ordinary face didn't have much of a story worth asking after. She kept her hair pulled back tight. She wore her scrubs a size looser than she needed to. She answered questions in short, complete sentences, and never elaborated unless someone pushed her to. The other nurses on her floor had decided within her first month that she was either painfully shy or quietly arrogant, and they couldn't agree on which, so they mostly left her alone, which was exactly what she wanted. Dr. Graham Asquith did not leave her alone. He was the kind of physician who had built an entire personality out of the letters after his name. He'd trained in Toronto, done a fellowship somewhere with a long European name he mentioned often, and treated the nursing staff the way some treat furniture. Useful, expected to stay in its place, and occasionally complained about when it didn't perform exactly as intended. He had taken a particular interest in finding fault with Eleanor since her second week. When she'd quietly flagged a dosing calculation he'd written for an elderly cardiac patient, she hadn't confronted him in front of anyone. She'd taken it to the charge nurse, who'd taken it to him privately, and the order had been corrected before anything happened to the patient. But Asquith didn't experience it as a problem caught. He experienced it as a humiliation survived. And he never quite forgave her for being the reason it existed. Since then, he made a habit of testing her in front of others. Pop quizzes disguised as professional curiosity, delivered loud enough for residents to hear, designed less to teach than to expose. That Tuesday morning was no different. He found her at the medication cart counting out vials, and planted himself a few feet away with his arms crossed. Two residents trailing behind him, like they were being shown something interesting at a zoo. "Voss," he said, pitching his voice for an audience. "Walk me through the management of a tension pneumothorax in a patient who doesn't present with the textbook tracheal shift, since you seem to think you know things." Eleanor didn't look up from the vials. She answered without missing a beat. The landmark for needle decompression, the gauge, the angle, the follow-up chest tube, placement, the monitoring afterward, the two-person verification protocol that she'd already noticed, got skipped more often than it should have on this floor. She said it the way someone says something they've actually done, in a place where saying it wrong meant someone died. Not the way someone recites something they memorized for a test. The silence afterward lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Asquith recovered by calling it textbook parroting, told her that reciting a manual wasn't the same as understanding medicine, and informed her, for the residents' benefit as much as hers, that she should stick to her station and let people with actual training make the clinical calls. He turned and walked off, the residents falling in step behind him. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes named Dr. Mara, glanced back at Eleanor for half a second too long, an expression on her face that wasn't quite pity, before she caught herself and followed the others. The morning got worse before it got better, the way Tuesdays sometimes do at a hospital that serves half the Niagara region. A pill-up on the QEW sent 6 patients through the ambulance bay inside of half an hour, and Eleanor was pulled off the floor to help absorb the wave, which was standard when volumes spiked like that. She worked the way she always worked, without being told twice, anticipating what the doctors needed before they asked for it, moving through the chaos with a spatial awareness that took most trauma nurses years to develop, and that she seemed to have walked in with. A man came through with a deep laceration to the femoral region, bleeding in a way that frightened the resident standing closest to him. It was Eleanor who got pressure on it with the kind of precision that bought the surgical team the minutes they needed. A teenage girl arrived struggling to breathe, lips going the wrong color, and the attending hesitated, genuinely froze just for a second or two, and it was Eleanor who had the airway kit assembled and in his hands before he'd finished processing what he was looking at. Blade already seated, tube already sized off the girl's build. She didn't announce any of it, She didn't look around for credit. She just worked the way. Water finds the lowest point in a room without being told to. Until the wave broke and the bay went quiet again. And the people who'd been drowning in it looked up to see what had carried them through. Dr. Asquith arrived 40 minutes into it. He hadn't been called. He wasn't on trauma rotation that day. But word travels fast in a hospital. And he had a habit of materializing wherever there was an audience for his authority. He stood at the entrance to the bay and watched Eleanor for a long moment before he came in. And when he did, he went straight to the char nurse. A tall, no-nonsense woman named Donna Whitlock, who'd been doing this job since before Asquith had finished puberty, and told her that a probationary nurse had been operating well outside the bounds of her training, and that it needed to go on record. Donna looked at him the way you look at a fire alarm going off over burnt toast. She told him Eleanor's interventions had been textbook appropriate, and that without her the morning would have gone considerably worse for at least 2 of those patients. Asquith told her it wasn't her call to make, that he'd be escalating it to the director of nursing, that Eleanor was a liability who'd been allowed to operate without proper oversight, and someone was eventually going to get hurt because of it. And then lowering his voice into something he must have believed sounded measured and reasonable, he said the part that mattered. He said maybe it was worth looking into where exactly someone like her had come from. What kind of background produced someone so comfortable with that level of violence? Because that was the word he used, violence, applied to the human body with that little visible reaction. Donna went very still. So did Eleanor, who was standing 8 feet away with a tray of used instruments in her hands, close enough to have heard every word clearly. She didn't respond. She didn't cross the room. She set the tray down on the counter, with exactly the same care she'd have used on any other day, peeled off her gloves, washed her hands for the full count, and walked out of the bay and down the corridor to the staff washroom, where she stood at the sink and ran the cold tap over her wrists, and breathed the way she'd been taught to breathe a long time ago, in places that didn't have names you'd find on a map. In moments when panic was a luxury nobody around her could afford, she had survived things that would have unmade a man like Graham Asquith from the inside out. She had carried equipment up mountainsides in the dark. She had lost people she loved and finished the job anyway, because the job didn't pause for grief. She had come home to a country that didn't know what to do with her, and had quietly folded herself back into something smaller, something that fit, because it was the only way back to a normal life she still half believed she deserved. She was not going to let a man with an ego and a parking spot with his name on it unmake any of that. She looked at her reflection. She breathed out slow until her shoulders dropped back to where they belonged. Then she dried her hands and went back to work. And she had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, the careful smallness she'd built for herself was about to come apart in front of everyone. The call reached the hospital's security desk at 9:45 the next morning. The man who took it, a retired OPP officer named Walter, who'd manned that desk for 6 years, and thought he'd heard everything a phone could deliver. Later said the voice on the other end had a flatness to it that made him sit up before he understood why. The caller identified himself by rank, gave a contact number through official channels for verification, and said a small team would be arriving at the hospital at approximately 10:15, requesting brief non-disruptive access to a nurse named Eleanor Voss. Walter verified the number, then he called it again, because something about the calm in the voice made him want to be sure. The verification came back clean both times. He notified the director of nursing, who notified the hospital administrator, who happened to mention it to Dr. Asquith, since Asquith had filed a formal incident report on Eleanor that very morning, and the administrator assumed it was somehow connected. Asquith took the news with quiet satisfaction. He assumed it was an investigative visit, possibly a licensing inquiry, and allowed himself a small private smile that he believed made him look composed and actually made him look smaller than he knew. At 10:12, the lobby of St. Catherine's General became a different kind of room. They came through the main doors together, 7 of them, dressed in clothing subdued enough to pass for civilian, at a glance but unmistakably not civilian to anyone who knew what they were looking at. They moved the way people move when their bodies have been trained to operate at exactly the speed required, and never an ounce faster. Unhurried, economical eyes sweeping the room out of pure habit rather than suspicion. Men and women, a range of ages, a range of builds, all carrying that same quality. Eleanor carried a stillness underneath the motion, an awareness of every exit in a room they'd just walked into. They identified themselves at the security desk with credentials that had the supervisor on the phone within 30 seconds. They asked for Nurse Eleanor Voss. They said it wasn't an emergency, they said it was personal. The lobby went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when something walks into them that doesn't belong to the established order of the place. A woman in the waiting chairs lowered her phone. An orderly pushing a cart slowed without meaning to. Word moved through the floor faster than any overhead page. The way it does in hospitals, and it reached Donna Whitlock at the nurse's station. Seconds before her phone buzzed with the same message, she looked up and across the station at Eleanor, who was charting on a tablet entirely unaware. Donna came around the desk, and put a hand lightly on Eleanor's arm, and told her there were people downstairs asking for her by name. She said they'd shown federal credentials. She said it carefully, watching Eleanor's face for whatever was about to happen there. What happened wasn't fear, and it wasn't confusion. It was something Donna would spend years trying to describe properly and never quite manage. The look of someone who has spent a long time waiting for a particular knock on the door, and has simply never known which day it would come. Eleanor set the tablet down. She straightened her scrubs without thinking about it. She said she'd go see what they wanted, and she walked toward the elevators with the same unhurried measured stride she used for everything. And Donna stood there, and felt the strange vertigo of watching someone she thought she'd known for a year become in the space of about 4 seconds, a complete stranger. Dr. Asquith was in the lobby when the elevator doors opened. He'd positioned himself near the front desk as, in a way he believed conveyed supervisory authority. He watched the group of 7 turn, almost as one body when Eleanor stepped out, and he watched something move through them. A current, a recognition. Before the one nearest the front, a broad-built man somewhere in his late 40s, with a face like weathered granite stepped forward. He didn't offer a hand. He came to full, rigid attention in the middle of the hospital lobby, and he saluted her. Sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. Directed at a woman in pale blue scrubs, with a pen clipped to her chest pocket and a stethoscope around her neck. Behind him the other 6 did the same in perfect unison, like something rehearsed 1,000 times, and never once for show. The lobby went completely silent. Eleanor looked at the 7 of them for one long beat. And then she straightened. And it was different from how she normally held herself. Different from the careful, deliberate smallness she'd worn into every room in that building for the past 11 months. The unconscious folding in that people in her position learn to do so. They take up less space than they actually deserve. She stood the way a body stands, when it remembers exactly what it was built for. She returned the salute, clean and automatic, like no time had passed at all. The man lowered his hand and spoke, his voice carrying clean across the lobby. He said that 6 weeks ago, an anonymous tip, later confirmed to have come from her, had led their unit to intercept a plot that would have killed dozens of people at a transit hub 2 provinces away. He said the source had refused to be identified, that it had taken them most of those 6 weeks to trace the intelligence back far enough to find out who'd sent it. He said they'd found her. He said they'd come to thank her in person. And that the people she'd once served beside, the ones still walking around because of the decisions she'd made under conditions most people couldn't imagine, had never once stopped being grateful and never would. Then he said her name, her actual name, not the soft civilian version she answered to hear, but the full designation she'd carried through nearly 5 years of deployments that didn't officially exist on paper anywhere. He said it with the kind of reverence reserved for people who have personally saved your life. And never once asked for anything in return. Dr. Asquith stood about 6 feet away through the whole thing, and did not move. His face went through several expressions in quick succession, that nobody in the lobby would forget for a long time. The administrator beside him said nothing. The residents who'd followed him down said nothing. Donna, who had come down without anyone noticing, stood near the elevators. With her hand pressed flat against her mouth. The silence held for a long beat. After the salute broke, after Eleanor stepped forward and embraced the first of them, and the second, and the lobby watched a woman they had overlooked and underestimated, and quietly diminished for almost a year become, all at once, fully and undeniably visible, in a way that nobody in that building would ever be able to take back. The group moved off toward a quieter corner near the windows, and Asquith crossed the lobby afterward, and stopped a few feet from Eleanor. And for the first time since she'd met him, he didn't seem certain what his next word should be. She looked at him, she waited. He said her name. Voss. And then stopped again. She let the silence sit there without rescuing him from it. Finally he said he hadn't known. She told him she was aware of that. He said that perhaps his comments in the bay yesterday had been somewhat harsher than the situation called for. She told him that if an apology was coming, it might be better directed at Donna, since she was the one he'd actually said it to. He blinked. She turned back toward her team, without waiting to see whether he had anything left to say. He followed her with his eyes for a moment, and then he didn't follow at all. By the end of the day, the hospital had processed the mourning, the way institutions process anything that overturns their assumptions. Slowly, awkwardly, with a fair amount of quiet recalculating. The director of nursing withdrew Asquith's incident report before lunch. The administrator sent Eleanor a meeting request. She still hadn't decided whether to accept by the time her shift ended. Dr. Mara found her in the break room around 4 o'clock, sat across from her without asking, and said simply that she'd learned something today. She wasn't going to forget, and asked if Eleanor might want to get coffee sometime off the clock. Eleanor said, maybe, which from her was practically an embrace. What didn't change was Eleanor herself. She finished her shift. She restocked the cart she'd been restocking the day before, when all of this had started. She answered a call light on the 4th floor for an 81-year-old man named Mr. Drabeck who couldn't reach the water glass on his tray table, and she handed it to him, and adjusted the pillow behind his back, and asked if there was anything else he needed, before she left for the night. He told her she had gentle hands, she said. She tried. She clocked out a little after 7, walked to her car in the lot, behind the building, and sat there for a few minutes in the gray, early evening quiet before she turned the key. She hadn't become a nurse because it was the easy thing to do afterward. She hadn't come here looking for anyone to recognize her. She'd come because after everything, the years before this had asked her to carry, she needed to spend the rest of them putting people back together, instead of the alternative. She wasn't finished. She was only getting started. And that was the whole quiet power of a woman who never once needed anyone to know her name. In order to do the right thing anyway,